Dragon leaned heavily against the round, wooden table, a weight on his back that seemed to dig deep into his shoulders as he stared at his father. Across from him, Garp sat with his sleeping son, a tense air around him even if he could see the undercurrents of joy in the Vice Admiral's eyes. His name is Luffy. Dragon's voice was rough and low, barely louder than the crackle of the candle that illuminated the tiny, wooden room. Garp let out a gruff laugh, uncaring if he woke the child in his arms. His dark eyes never left Luffy, searching for something in the boy that Dragon didn't understand. Monkey D. Luffy. Garp nodded to himself, a smile firmly in place. I have a feeling about this one, son. He spoke as he used a large finger to caress the sleeping child's cheek, a tiny smile forming on Luffy's mouth. Dragon felt a pull in his chest and he stilled, his mouth tilting down at the edges as he stared at the child in his father's grasp. Garp's eyes rose and settled on him, heavy and searching. There's something you're not telling me. He always hated how his father always seemed to know. He looked away from the unwavering gaze, unwilling to speak while he looked a man in the eye. He was silent for a while, listening to the soft rain against the roof and the far-off thunder of the passing storm. Garp took note of his silence and tensed, leaning forward carefully, as his eyes boring into him. Dragon opened his mouth, hesitance shrouding him and making his father hold his breath. The last time Dragon had hesitated, he was contemplating desertion. Dudes didn't hesitate, and anything that could make them weary was something to be cautious of. They both knew this. The words came out slowly, as if he was unwilling to believe them himself, even if he had been present for the event. I made a vow, with the sea as my witness. Garp's eyes seemed to darken, passing thoughts nearly visible on his face. Dragon looked down at his bandaged left hand, still healing. Even after a week, Garp noticed and trailed his gaze down, his eyes growing razor sharp. A pact of blood with the sea. He could still remember the night, how the violent waves had almost frozen their movement even as the wind continued to howl. The air was still in the room, yet the light of the candle flickered and dimmed as if an unseen force was making it wane. Dragon swallowed, raising his gaze to meet his father's eyes before trailing them down to the baby in his arms. His hair rose on end as he relived the memory, a dryness coating his throat and making his voice come out choked. A wave came and cleared the blood that I spilled, and in the next, the sea gave me this child. Dragon's lips pressed into a hard line as he saw his father freeze before slowly moving his eyes down to the baby in his arms. Garp jolted and Dragon looked down to see the baby wide awake, looking at his father with a soul-searching gaze. Like it knew. Dragon's breath caught in his throat when those eyes moved onto him, and it was ridiculous really to be so wound up and almost afraid of a baby. But the sea could be calm and loving before it reared her viciousness in the blink of an eye, and this was her child. In the silence of the room, he could hear his father take a shuddering breath, his gaze entirely focused on the baby who blinked and smiled up at him. The flame of the candle stilled its movements, and the room grew brighter once more as Luffy closed his eyes and went back to sleep. Dragon swallowed hard, moving his gaze back up to his father and watching the color slowly return to his face. Tell me exactly what you felt, heard, saw. Garp's voice held a no-nonsense tone, like he was aware of what Dragon had done and was simply trying to confirm his suspicions. His father's eyes never left Luffy's sleeping face as he began to speak. It was dark, the moon on the horizon, and the wind was loud. I made my vow, offered my blood, and turned away. He had done as many before him, offering their dreams to the sea. What did you hear? It wasn't a question, and Dragon wasn't sure how his father knew. He narrowed his eyes, searching his father's face, looking down at the baby bundled in his arms, eerily still. Drums. Garp raised a hand to his face, leaning heavily on it even as he shook his head, an empty laugh escaping from his throat. His going to be a riot, you know. Garp sat straight and began rocking the child in his arms, his shoulders losing their tension. A child of the sea and a D. Garp threw his head back and laughed, full-bodied and uncaring of anything in world. Dragon didn't share his enjoyment, still lost on what his father knew. That he didn't When the older man's laughter died down, his smile remained, looking at Dragon with an excitement that made him weary. Many men have made vows to the sea. It has been a long, long time since she has taken any up on the offer. His heart seemed to beat harder in his chest, stuttering even as he kept his gaze perfectly level at his father's words. Luffy is yours, bound by blood. He may not have been the answer you were expecting, but the sea will fulfill your dream, because it's hers too, and that was putting it lightly. Dragon could not take care of a child. Of all things, he was in the middle of a revolution and a wanted criminal. Any child of his would be hunted and used against him, and that had always been why he so adamantly never wanted one. Yet, here he was, small with a puff of black hair and eyes that made his heart skip. Dragon paused and furrowed his brows, catching Garp's last words. What's her dream? What could something as powerful as the sea wish for that it didn't have? Or what was it that it wanted to keep? His father's gaze was unimpressed, and he answered like it was a fact known since the beginning of man. The thunder boomed in the distance, and the winds howled against the cabin they were in. Dragon tried to ignore the fact that the storm should have long since passed as he waited for the answer with a bated breath. Isn't it obvious? Garp ruffled the tuft of black hair on Luffy's head, and a sleepy smile met his gesture. To be free. Heavy footsteps were heard as his men ran around on the ship, his own drowned out in the noise. He looked through cabinets, chests, and even under beds, but the small, unassuming chest was gone as if plucked out of reality. Captain, Lucky Roo shouted from above deck, and Shanks practically threw himself up the stairs. Lucky was near the figurehead of the ship, pointing to something laying on the wood. He moved closer, looking where he was pointing, and felt the blood drain from his face. In the dragon figurehead's mouth was a chest, pried open and swollen with seawater. I didn't move it, just in case. He nodded and climbed up and forwards, wrapping his legs around a wood and heaving himself up to take a better look. The lock of the chest looked rusted and old, as if they hadn't just bought it a few months ago. But more importantly, it was coated with dried salt and stained with water. Inside, the chest was full of seawater, and a single sand dollar was inside. He cursed under his breath and flung the chest onto the deck, swinging off the figurehead and following it. Close behind, as seawater sloshed everywhere, his crew stared at him in the empty box, eyes wide and postures tense. By now they all knew their anchor was a sea child, but none thought he would do this. Shanks swallowed and barked out his order to wait as he turned on his heel and ran to where he knew Luffy would be. The foliage was a blur as he sprinted towards the beach. The waves were crashing especially hard that day, and the wind seemed harsher than normal. He spotted Luffy sitting on the beach, a small dot in the distance, and hunched over something. The waters surrounded him in a circle, as if trying to hide him from view. Shanks ran faster, ignoring how his balance was off in the sand and the burning of his lungs. The waves crashed higher, and the sun was blocked off by clouds. He heard Luffy's distant voice full of disgust. Bleh. I don't want the rest, though, it's so gross. A wave engulfed Luffy, and Shanks felt his breath catch. That was the first time he had actually seen Luffy pulled underwater. Urgency made him move faster, his heavy breathing stuttering in his fear. Luffy emerged in the next wave as Shanks' feet hit the water, and the young boy scowled as he turned towards the ocean. I didn't want it. You didn't have to shove it in my mouth. Luffy stuck his tongue out and swiped at it, as if to get rid of the taste. Luffy, the child, jolted at the sound of his voice, and his eyes widened when he spotted Shanks wading in towards him, jumping up and trying to meet him halfway. Shanks, what is it? He wasn't sure what face he had on, but Luffy seemed concerned, and for once in his life, listened to what he had to say. Shanks grabbed Luffy from the sea, unsure how the waters would react to him, and shook the young boy. Luffy, what did you eat? Luffy was looking up at him with wide eyes, confusion on his face for a split second before he stuttered out his response. A fruit thing. It was so gross though, but Mom made me finish it. The child made a face, and Shanks stilled his movements, suddenly unsure. What did it look like? How did you get it? He spoke as he waded out the water, carefully holding Luffy away from the sea. Swirly and purple. Mom gave it to me. Why? His anchor's voice held genuine confusion, and Shanks lost any anger he had managed to gather. There was no way Luffy had done this on purpose. He sat down with a heavy sigh and set Luffy on his lap, looking out towards the ocean and the calming waves. She gave it to you, he repeated, glancing down into Luffy's large, honest eyes. At his nod, he pinched the bridge of his nose and let out another long sigh. What you ate, it's called a devil fruit. To normal people, it makes them unable to swim ever again. They become actual anchors in the water and lose all their strength. He bit his lip, stroking Luffy's wet hair, and carefully didn't look at him as he continued. But you're different, Anchor. I just don't know how yet. I never would have thought that your mother would feed that to you. They both stayed quiet for a while, Shanks lost in thought and Luffy looking towards the waters with furrowed brows and slightly panicked eyes. The red-haired pirate assessed the boy, noting how his eyes began to water as he stared at the crashing waves. Shanks hesitated for a moment before breaking the silence with a soft whisper. Is she saying something? Luffy didn't move for a moment, but eventually he nodded his head and seemed to look like he had too much information given to him at once. Can you tell me what she said? He adjusted Luffy to face him and cupped his tiny head with his hands, making the young boy look up at him. Luffy's face scrunched up, as if trying to get the words out in the right order. Hurt his head. She said they were stolen from her. She always wanted them back. Luffy frowned and tilted his head to the side, nuzzling into his large, calloused hands. Like anyone else, Shanks had always assumed that the sea hated the fruits, just like everyone else. Now, though, he could see why it made sense. After all, devil fruit users were dragged down. Luffy took in a shaky breath and continued, and that she's okay with me having it, cause I am her. Luffy blinked open his eyes and grinned, unaware of how his words had made Shanks stiffen and freeze his thoughts. Sheh, whatever that means. Shanks swallowed hard and let out a shaky breath, mind restarting and whirling with the possibilities. Anchor, let's try this out. Let's head back in the water. Luffy nodded excitedly and bounced up ready to flee, but Shanks grabbed his hand and held him back. Or so he thought. Instead, he watched with wide eyes as Luffy's arm stretched as he ran into the water, his eyes widening further as Luffy waited, and with no ill effects. He let the hand go in his surprise, and that caught the child's attention. Luffy turned his head back, and his eyes wittied as he saw his elongated arm snapping back towards him. Church. Shanks let out a roaring laugh as he watched Luffy's own hand smack him in the face, and he fell fully into the water in his shock. Luffy sat up, sputtering and staring at his hand before he tilted his head back and laughed. Shanks shook his head, clearing away his laughter as he observed Luffy enjoying himself in the sea. He was glad the child was okay to still be in the water. After all, what a tragedy it would have been for a sea child to be rejected by his own mother, though it did give him more things to think about. It wasn't the first time Shanks had seen the wrath of the sea, but it was the first time he had seen it single someone out. He stood at the edge of the dock, his teeth bared and fists clenched as he watched the pirate hold Luffy against his side with a sword to his throat. The little dinghy they were on was swaying violently, the ocean churning in anger underneath them. The only reason Shanks hadn't thrown himself into the water was because Makino held him back, a knowing look in her eye that forced him to wait and see. Remember what I told you. She spoke even as the man continued to taunt them with Luffy's life. He did remembered how sure she was in her own words. But still, it was hard to just watch as someone he came to care for was in danger. Luffy didn't look scared, though. When he had been thrown into the boat, he had looked relieved. He tried to trust them, their faith, but as he saw the Sea King Rissy up behind them, he moved forward, this time held back by his first mate. Ben, he shouted, angry and worried all at the same time. Trust in their faith. Ben's grip on his shoulder was tight, and Shanks could see the man was just as worried and stressed as he. He let out a curse and turned back to the sea, only to find the small boat shattered and nothing else in sight. Luffy, he shouted and jerked forward again, high eyes searching the sea desperately. Bubbles came up from near the dock, and the sea King rose its massive head from the water. On top, Luffy was giggling. Like mad, his smile bright as he waved at them. Look, I made a new friend. Shanks sagged in relief as the Sea King nudged Luffy towards the dock, and he wasted no time in taking the boy from its head. The beast gave him a long, considering look before slinking back into the ocean, fading away into the dark depths. Shanks smiled at the happy boy in his arms until the moment caught up with him and his brow ticked in anger. You idiot. He rubbed Luffy's head harshly with his knuckles and scolded the boy, telling him his big mouth would get him in more trouble someday. Luffy cried and clung to him even as his head was viciously rubbed. Oh, I'm sorry, Dad. At his shout, everyone on the dock froze before whipping their heads over to Shanks. He felt all their eyes on him but forced down his blush and gritted his teeth as he rubbed his fist into Luffy's head. You brat. It was a weak distraction. Shanks knew everyone noticed that he didn't deny the claim. Luffy was sound asleep on the bar, drool coming out of his mouth, and arms askew. He was on the edge of the stool, and his black hair shined under the waning hearth. Makino was beginning to close the bar, and Shanks would wait for her to finish if he could stay with Luffy just a bit longer. His crew was already out on the ship, having stumbled their way over a few minutes ago as quiet as they could. The creaking of the door made him start, and he glanced over his shoulder, wondering who would come in at such a late time. Makino seemed to recognize the old man coming in and gave him an exasperated sigh. You know, he's going to be grumpy when you wake him. Her tone was scolding as she dried another tankard, but didn't stop the stooping man covered in gray. He gave her an apologetic smile, voice hoarse. My apologies, but I have to leave early in the morning and my day was tied up. Figured I'd rather wake him now while I have a chance. The old man moved his gaze to him and gave a shy nod. Shanks didn't move when the old man went to wake Luffy, figuring it was fine since Makino continued to clean. Luffy grumbled and squeezed his eyes tighter before slowly blinking them open, noticing the old man shaking him awake. Merchant man. Luffy mumbled and rubbed his eyes, his head seeming to be too heavy for his body as he tried to stay awake. I'm sorry, Luffy, but I leave very early in the morning. I was wondering, will it be safe? Shanks raised a brow at the question and briefly glanced out the window, noting the still air and cloudless sky. Luffy sighed heavily and scrunched his face, mumbling under his breath and shook his head. No. There's a storm tomorrow. But you bring my meat, I'll tell Mama to wait. With another yawn, Luffy snuggled his head back onto the wooden bar and promptly fell asleep. The old man sighed and ruffled the black locks with a quiet thank you before he turned, nodded to Makino, and left. Shanks glanced at Luffy and then to Makino, brows raised in question. She giggled behind her hand and moved to gather Luffy up, but he beat her to it. Shanks hoisted the tiny boy up in his arms, letting him settle comfortably to sleep on his shoulder. She raised her own brow at him and he completely ignored the look, murmuring out his own question. What was that? His voice was a low timbre, and the green-haired woman gave him an amused smile. Some of the older folk think Luffy is something more. We never tell him that's the deal, but it's their way of asking for safe passage. And the sea. Can't say I blame them. Luffy has a perfect track record so far. Makino turned off the lights and he walked out, lifting his head in the warm breeze. He glanced down at Luffy, watching as he snuggled deeper into the crook of his neck and felt something warm settle in his chest at the sight. He loves you, you know. Makino's voice was quiet as they began their walk to the beach, both stealing glances at the sleeping child. Shanks didn't respond, just tightened his grip and hated that he had to go. The call of adventure had been too strong, too much for Shanks to resist. He desperately wanted to go as much as he wanted to stay. But even now his anchor is pulling along the sea floor. Luffy is staring up at him with sad, determined eyes, his fists clenched at his side. It felt like the 100th time he had said the same thing, but Shanks knew how stubborn Luffy could be. I'm sorry, Anchor, but you can't. Come. He saw the tears being held back and felt the guilt settle in his belly all over again as he watched the child try not to cry. Fine, I'll make my own crew. Luffy glared up at him in Determination, eyes piercing in a way that made Shanks freeze. They'll be even better than yours, and I'm going to be the greatest pirate alive. Luffy was panting, white-knuckled, and daring Shanks to challenge him. And when I do, I'll become the king of the pirates. Shanks let out a laugh, ruffling his hair and watching the morning sun ignite his eyes. Luffy shook him off and spread his arms wide, two large smiles stretching across his face as he tilted his head up towards him. Golden sunlight shone on Luffy and his black hair lit up. In its rays, I'm gonna be the freest man in the world. The air left his lungs like he had been punched, and for a moment, all Shanks could see was his captain, smile wide, arms out, declaring his dream to be free. His eyes stung as he looked down at the smiling boy who now seemed larger than life. He swallowed the lump in his throat and smiled, taking off his straw hat and bending on a knee. Promise me then, Luffy, that when you become a great pirate, you'll give me back this hat. It's very precious to me. He was glad his voice was even, knowing Ben and Lucky were boring holes into the back of his head. Luffy blinked up at him and his smile grew even wider, nodding his head with enthusiasm. It was then that Shanks realized that he never got Luffy's full name. Not in the whole year that he had been around. It hadn't seemed important at the time, but now he had to know. Give me a verbal promise, Luffy, one in front of the sea. Shanks held his breath even as he placed the straw hat on his anchor's tiny head. It shadowed his bright eyes, but the smile was there all the same. I'm Monkey D. Luffy, and I will be king of the pirates. The ocean roared in his ears, and he let out a bark of laughter when he realized where fate had led him. Another D. I can't wait, anchor.